Hello and welcome to week 4 of Communication Conflict Resolution. I am your instructor, Michael Betker, and here we are kicking off module number 3, which is all about power. So let's talk about that, and obviously we start off with chapter 2. We've already been through the second half of chapter 2. Now we're going to tackle pages 25 through 34. As we always do, here's the things to make and do for week 4. Now, not nearly as aggressive as last week. Last week, obviously, what was due was your test, your first test, a reading quiz, and a thought piece, all due on Sunday. But in this case here now, we just have 2 reading quizzes focused on some of the readings. So a little lighter fare, and you can see more of this moving forward. So first I'd like you to do is watch, obviously, this video. So if you're doing that, that's great. Along the way, you should also read chapter 2 and the 2 articles. Conflict at Work, a practical guide, which is really short. It's a one page, 2-sided, and an article called Where Does Power Come From, which talks about the different types of power you might encounter. And that's 6 pages. So really not too much in the way of reading this week. I'd also like you to watch The Butler, discussing the 60s, and they show a scene about how people prepared for a sit-in to raise awareness and create change with regard to the human rights movement. I'd also like you to watch another video on a person by the name of Saul Alinsky. Who the heck is Saul Alinsky? Well, you'll know a bit more after this lecture. And then there's 2 examples from videos I'd like you to watch as well, which are queued up in this module this week. The first is a Florida student speaking out on gun control down in Florida after a gun shooting, and also something more recently, even with Ocasio-Cortez and her exposition on dark money in the courts. So in Congress rather. So we'll take a look at them as well, and that's going to kind of round out our week. So let's proceed then, if we will. Obviously, the last thing I want you to do is think about reading the article Power of Talk for next week. So there's chapter 2, just focusing on pages 25 to 34. As we know, the second half was about conflict styles, which we've been through. Here are pictures of the 2 reading assignments: Zark Consultancy, Conflict at Work, and of course, Where Does Power Come From by Jeffrey Piper. Another thing I wanted to share with you guys, a book that I've read. You don't have to read this if you don't want to, but if you have interest in this topic, you want to do a deeper dive, or you're looking for what's known as prescriptive advice about how to avoid conflict at work. It's a great book. Obviously, it uses the parable of Cain and Abel through the Bible. And I read this book when I was a younger person and experiencing some of my own conflict. So if you're looking for further reading, you could read Cain and Abel. And it's easy to read, it's quick, and it is very helpful. All right, so let's talk about power. Power is a big part of what we talk about when it comes to conflict and how it's exercised. So in this chapter and in this week, we're going to discuss power. Power is defined as the ability to influence or control the behaviors of others. Now, we're going to talk today a lot about how that gets wielded both at work, as the articles discuss, and also more broadly through the political sphere and through what we see in popular culture. The 7 sources of power that you'll encounter here in your readings. The first is, of course, resources. And if you think about resources from a company standpoint, think about that one department fighting over resources against another department. But even more broadly, over on to our right here, we see Adolf Hitler and how he wielded power. And of course, World War II was all about resources in a large way. So his conquests of country after country, before finally being put to a stop to, involved capturing resources. Force, obviously, again, you could use Hitler as an example there, just using blunt force to gain power. And we'll talk about what that's like. And we'll talk about power over versus power with. The third point, skills, abilities, and expertise. So if you're a person who has skills and abilities or some type of expertise, that can give you a sense of power and feeling of power, particularly in the workplace. Knowledge, number 4. Just having knowledge. You've heard the statement, knowledge is power. We'll discuss that. 5, position. Just by being in a spot where you have control over situations or people allows you and affords you power, and we'll talk about some examples of that. Charisma, as we know, can also have power, and it's an interesting one. Certainly just being a very dynamic person in the workplace can lead to you obtaining power. And last but not least, using persuasive skills. And we'll talk about this at length. Saul Alinsky is tied to that. Martin Luther King, of course, was also tied to that. Others throughout history. And we'll talk about how persuasion can lead to power. I love this slide here. This is how I felt in my past, in certain jobs. And it really comes down to this top-down philosophy of how power gets wielded. And we'll talk more about this, but this sort of is a good illustration, I think, of this hierarchical sort of approach to power. And, if you're the little guy, clearly you don't have much of a say if you're in a traditional sort of environment, work environment. I pulled this from the internet. Keep them in the dark and feed them shit. Sorry if you guys are offended by the brow word there, but again, this is I've experienced this in my own life, and maybe you have as well. Just this idea that if you don't know, you're not supposed to know, and knowledge is power. Indeed, lots of folks stay in power by withholding information. So knowledge indeed is power, a form of power. All right, let's tap into chapter 2, those pages we talked about, the first portion. And kind of what we're going to talk about here early on, Max Weber, and frankly, most of all conflict theory back in the day originated around organizations and society. So they focused largely on corporations and kind of how power got wielded. And if you've seen the background there, I've got a little graph there that shows that top-down philosophy we've discussed on how power flows from the top down. And in most cases back then, it was not an open door policy, quite the opposite. It was like, okay, Jenkins, you are a little guy. You don't deserve to even have a question to ask me. So that's kind of the traditional way these theories kind of originated. Laws were enforced by administrative structure that was vertical and pyramidal, so kind of what we've talked about here with hierarchical arrangements of positions defined by duties and expertise. So in other words, if you're in your role, you're not allowed to kind of go outside the lines there in those situations. Now we'll discuss we'll show some examples where that's changed a lot in the last 15, 20 years, and specifically in the last 5 years. So power is the means, again, by which we get others to behave in ways they would not otherwise do. So especially if you can think within the context of your employment, we have power structures in place to make sure you do your job. French and Raven, a few other folks, obviously recognizing some shortcomings with Weber's perspective, define power as depending on the understanding between parties. So we'll talk more about that as well. All right, so I want to use an example. So we've got the old school way of thinking about things, right? The top-down piece. I want to share with you about some information about a company called Zappos that I happen to admire quite a bit. Zappos, as we know, started out as a shoe company for men online. Now, obviously, if you're looking to shop on price, Zappos is not the place to go. But what I love about Zappos is its focus on a few things. First and foremost, they've defined themselves as a company that's focused on giving good customer service, and frankly, they do. When price is not as much of an issue, it's more about, gosh, can I return my shoes without any problems? And of course, Zappos overachieves there by providing great customer service. They also encourage growth and learning among their employees. So toward that end, where you had in the old school days, you had the top-down philosophy here. Zappos is really a very flat hierarchy. In other words, the CEO of the company sits alongside the newest of new hires, and nobody talks about title at Zappos. So that's part of their culture. But really, this focus on growth and learning among their employees is a part of that. Focusing on team is the third thing they kind of focused on and outlined in their corporate culture. That's different from what we used to know. So your employees are the face and soul of the community. Last but not least, it's one of Zappos' core values saying, quote, "We don't take no, or that'll never work for an answer, because if we had, then Zappos would have never started in the first place." So really, they're always looking for solutions. They're always looking for win-win solutions at every turn. Also, additionally, the tangential stuff, obviously you can bring a dog to work there. So, and this is culture, like I said, it's just a fun, interesting place that really is flying in the face of traditional organizations. So know that obviously we have to evolve our focus on conflict as companies change and grow. All right, so let's talk a bit about traditional theory of power. French and Raven identified 5 categories of such motivating qualities. So the first one is known as legitimate or positional conflict. And that's based on the relative position the person holds in the organization, and only has this person stays in that position. It really comes down to your position and the ability to wield power based on that, the rights and titles given by that position. Something called referent power, which is based on the ability of the person to attract others. And I've got a couple examples for each of these, but obviously that's based on charisma and your ability to wield interpersonal skills. An example there would be the community activist that initiates a petition to get better quality water. The third is expert power, and that's, again, of course, obviously if you have expertise in an area, you're able to then exercise that within the context of a business. An example of that, of course, we all know a doctor has expertise, right? Particularly if, let's say, for example, you have heart trouble and you're going to a heart specialist, they, of course, would have the best opinion to make. Here's an example of doctor's expertise in dealing with the Ebola virus and her or his power to influence policy decisions around that. So in other words, you might find somebody from the government trying to contain the Ebola virus and calling attention to that and bringing somebody in to expound upon that. Something called rewards power, which uses an individual's capability to reward other people. So in other words, if you're a boss, you can provide a gift or certificate or something else, or maybe a raise or some other promotion to reward an employee for good behavior, for doing things that are above and beyond the call of duty. Special note there may be an overlapping in this case with the power exercised based on the position. And finally, something on the dark side of this, more coercive power, which implies the possibility of withholding rewards. So you got rewards power versus coercive power. And frankly, rewards power can be also wielded inefficiently and almost in a way to reward somebody at the expense of another. So both can be positive or negative. And I would say coercive power in most cases is like the dark side of things. So example of that is the exercise of power business leaders may show to pressure governmental agencies for a decision in their favor. Of course, the dark side of that, again, would be using that to get people to do things that are against their will. So some examples, legitimate or positional conflict. Now, I wanted to share this with you if you guys remember this. It's way back in 2011 when we had a Republican governor, Scott Walker, and also a Republican-controlled Senate. Now, they used that special time to limit or remove collective bargaining rights, among other things. So obviously, it was really about breaking the unions in Wisconsin. So they had a lot of success with that, obviously, because they had a situation where they could pass this. Now, they passed it in the dead of night. And if you remember the story, Democratic senators defected to Chicago for a period of time. And of course, it was a huge deal, made national news, before finally getting Walker to agree to some kind of concessions there. So whatever they did there managed to kind of help a little bit, but ultimately the result was using this positional power to get rid of the unions. And the big issue there, particularly if you're a teacher, was the removal of collective bargaining rights, which was really the big chip on the table there. Okay, so expert power, a good example of that, I would say, is if you know Henry Kissinger, he's been around forever and a day. It's amazing the guy's still alive and functioning in politics, but he's been around for many, many presidencies. His claim to fame really is his connection with China, and he spent a lot of time overseas wielding that power. So he came back here as a statesman in many capacities and for many presidents. But note that his expert power was overseas and his ability to kind of negotiate deals with, and sometimes dubious deals, with China and other countries. So that's an example of expert power. Referent power. Now, J.J. Watt is from Pewaukee, right by my house here, so it's kind of nice. I've actually seen him out in public here. But I love this. His kind of goal was to obviously drive hurricane relief after one of the recent hurricanes that hit down there. So he used that very effectively, his referent power. So it's really star power, almost in a way. You can call it star power or referent power. And, of course, he created a groundswell of support and raised a ton of money, truckloads of stuff that came from Wisconsin as well, and some of the companies I worked for sent generators down there. So really a very powerful sort of way to wield power. Another version of power or way of thinking about power is something called rewards power. We've discussed that. Now I want to share this with you, and this is a good example of rewarding somebody. Now, obviously, we know that every president has full rights to pardon folks, and newly minted President Donald J. Trump chose to pick Joe Arpaio as his first pardon. So that's an example of, I would say, rewards power for Arpaio's support for his campaign over the years. Now, Joe Arpaio, a very controversial character from Arizona. Obviously, he's a sheriff down there, and the big issue down there is immigration. As we know now, flashing forward, Donald J. Trump's really focused on that as well. Trump, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically said that why shouldn't we condemn this person for doing his job? Well, what Arpaio was doing was racial profiling. So they were making stops with people who had brown skin, basically driving through Arizona And of course, he was told to cease and desist, and Arpaio openly and willfully thumbed his nose at the government, which led to him being convicted and put in the pokey in the clink for a while. Trump, of course, then saw that as an opportunity to wield his power. So that's, again, rewards power, an example. So let's break down coercive versus reward power. Coercive, obviously, is more strong arm of the law kind of approach versus reward power, which is a little bit more proactive and rewards-based. So on the left-hand column, you've got punitive acts. These are all kind of coercive. Punitive acts, in other words, just doing things in a negative way. Somebody does something wrong, you punish them, basically. Negative acts, scolding, belittling in front of others, inflicting pain or physical emotional stuff, which can happen. And this is maybe on more in the interpersonal stuff within families and things like that. Depriving people of things altogether or paying no attention can all be forms of coercive power. Of course, on the right-hand side, the reward power is more responsibility for the self. Privileges and choices being given. Verbal praise, as, for example, saying somebody did really a nice job on a test or a paper. Verbal praise at work, and sometimes that goes a long way, just the verbal praise, saying nice job on that report or such thing. And maybe that's in fact, they know research shows that that's oftentimes more valuable to employees than almost anything else. Expressions of love, warmth, respect, a show and expression of belief in the student's dignity. So again, this is geared towards students. And finally, attention to students' needs are all examples of providing rewards. So this translates, of course, then to power over versus power with. So let's talk about that. Power over is, of course, again, thinking about this top-down philosophy. So in other words, I'm your boss. You have the opportunity then to wield power over them through coercion, which we've just discussed, which really is characterized by brute force leadership in many cases. So in other words, pounding the table and saying it's my way or the highway. Dominance is a factor there, of course, with power over. So in other words, I have power over you, so therefore I'm going to dominate you. In these situations as well, one side vies for power over another. And lastly, it causes suspicion and contempt, and I would say over the long haul, it's not good for any company to have that kind of relationship unless you really have an iron-fisted grip. But ultimately, eventually it leads to some tactics we'll talk about here in class. On the right-hand side, we got power with, right? So that's another sharing power no matter what your role might be. It's more relational, obviously, and it's an understanding and having some empathy for the other person. It is, I would say, it's characterized by skillful leadership. In other words, leaders who are willing to give up power in exchange for this better relationship with workers and coworkers. It's more collective, as we know, and collaborative, and it's reciprocal. In other words, it leads to a creative synthesis. In other words, you get 1 + 1 = 3 in this situation when you share power. The book talks about Mary Parker Follett. So who was she? She was an American social worker, management consultant, and philosopher, and she was also a pioneer in the fields of organizational theory and organizational behavior. The book talks about her, and she said here in this quote, coercive power is the curse of the universe. Coactive, or as we've discussed, power with, or reward power, can lead to the enrichment and advancement of every human soul. So obviously, we've got a very empathic soul on our hands here. Along with, I believe, the book talks about also Lillian Galbraith, and she was one of 2 great women in management, early on in the early days of classical management theory, who kind of wielded this theory of coactive power, which is the opposite of coercive power. So, okay, so that's setting the table essentially. So you've got this, an understanding now of the types of power and the ways that theory kind of evolved over time to deal with how to capture and study the balance of power. So let's talk about the imbalances of power, right? So again, power over really is where parties are conscious about how much power they have over the other party. In the context of power imbalance, power can affect how parties view themselves. So I really want to talk about just what happens in these situations. And Hoogeveen and colleagues show that in their study that if one person believes he or she has power, his or her brain changes the way it operates. In other words, there's a physiological effect based on this notion of power. So over time, if you're being held down, you start believing that you don't have power, and that's really what happens. And that's really kind of the dark side of this top-down philosophy of power. So ultimately, their research kind of focused on something called mirror receptors in the brain, a recent discovery, really cool discovery. But this discovery about these receptors, these mirror receptors, really linked strongly to empathy for others, which is something that's really important. Ultimately, this research demonstrated that believing one has power diminishes empathy. So in other words, if you've got power over time, we've heard the statement, the absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is a great statement. Sort of talking about this. This research proves out that point. So toward that end, I would say this. Now, if you're caught up in a situation where you're in a top-down environment and people are wielding power over you, just know that you have an unending source of power within. So these two statements here really stolen liberally from the Eastern philosophies of life. These couple statements here. When mind is weak, situation is a problem. When mind is balanced, situation is challenge. When mind is strong, a situation becomes an opportunity. So really, this is something I talk about with my family, my kids in particular. You have the power to kind of create your situation, and how you think about things is really important. So you find yourself in a situation where where power is being wielded over you. You can really use the power of your mind to change the way you approach the situation. On the right-hand side, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. That's from the Buddha, obviously. And I love that statement as well. But the power of thought is at the core of this here. So in spite of everything else, you can still go within and find sources of power. All right, so let's talk about power imbalances in a more specific way. So power imbalance affects the dispute itself. There are 4 types of these here. The first one is a high power person or group refuses to engage the low power person because it knows it can get what it wants. So in other words, why would you want to give anybody below you any kind of power or the ability to negotiate? An example of that, of course, in rural societies, landowners would not engage with renters. So you could just shut them out. And that's one way of using high power to just basically ignore low power people or situations or groups. Conversely, a low power person or group would refuse to enter any dispute resolution for fear that it might be forced to make unwanted concessions. In other words, the opposite of that is just avoiding conflict with a high power person to save your bacon, essentially. An example of that would be a small country not wanting to negotiate with a powerful nation. A third, a high power person or group can simply impose its will on the other simply because it has the resources, force, or position. Good example of that would be China and Korea. And obviously, we've seen China wielding its influence there just by its largesse. We see this happening a lot in various campuses across the country here, where rental agencies really have carte blanche with the ability to set fees. The low power person, this is the fourth here, low power person or group may strive to build power before entering into a dispute resolution process. So an example of that would be labor unions creating a coalition before individual workers face management in disputes. So really that's what we're going to talk about here coming up now, how you gain power, right, if you don't have any. And Saul Alinsky is sort of the progenitor of that. Full name, and the book talks about this at length, but Saul David Alinsky, he was an American community organizer and writer back in the day. Now, President Obama, he was also, Saul Alinsky was also from Chicago, ironically. No connection with Obama, although Obama was also a community organizer, so who had a similar kind of approach, but ultimately there's been no indicator that they're connected. Alinsky is generally considered to be the founder of modern community organizing. He's also noted for his book, The Rules for Radicals, which we'll talk more about. There is a video, by the way, in this segment. I encourage you to watch that. It's a news clip. His name was batted around quite a bit back in the day by Newt Gingrich, who was then, of course, a candidate for presidency. And he was using that as a polarizing effect. Saul Alinsky type tactics were seen as maybe over the top. All right, so what is this all about? Essentially, it's how you gain power. And he admits that power comes in 2 forms, both either money or people, or both. If you have no money, what do you do? So a lot of times he would do things to rally the people, the power of the people, to support a change. Some principles of his use of power. Power exists in relationships. It's like conflict in a lot of ways. So there's power there, and it's how it's distributed is really dependent upon some things you can do. Power is about perception. So in other words, if you go in with no power, but you're able to create the perception of power, that can have value. Number 3, some power is resource-based, like in conflict. So in other words, if you have all the chips on the table and you go all in, you have 10 cents left, going all in is not going to be as important or powerful as going all in and being the incumbent. And lastly, but not leastly, the exercise of power may be necessary for change, so we'll talk more about that. But as we've known from history, the human rights, the civil rights movement, and others, women's rights, all those things came through, taking back some of the power to make change that ultimately is good for everybody. Here's a quote by Saul Alinsky: "Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have." So again, that's a wink and a nod to that number 2 point there. Power is about perception. Somebody who wielded this power, the Saul Alinsky-like approach, was Dr. Martin Luther King. So in the 4th outcome of power imbalance described on the previous slide, the low power person or group needs to build power. Another way of working to create power balance is non-violent resistance. It's something that MLK, Martin Luther King, wielded very well. And if you watch that clip, the sit-in from the movie The Butler, which is a great movie, by the way, you got to watch it, but it's sort of arresting, so I apologize if it's somewhat unsettling, but this is how it was. And I've actually read reviews on this and folks who lived back then and lived through that type of stuff, that this is right on point. So watch that clip and you'll get a feel for how you train to take power back, basically, using some of these tactics. And a sit-in is something that, a tool that was used quite liberally back in the day. So watch that clip. I would say it's really fascinating to see how that kind of played out and how they trained folks in spite of really, really tough situations to hold their ground and essentially create awareness is what they did. They created power in the space of none by using kind of the news and using kind of like these larger sort of events to create and stir up trouble in the face of racism. I love this quote here. Dr. Martin Luther King: "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." So lovely quote there. I wanted to share with you this. Now, it's not dead, all right? This idea of love and using love to create justice is not dead at all. I would say I was really encouraged. Now, I put this link in there as well. This is not in the book or anything else, but I thought this was truly inspiring to see. No matter what side of the fence you fall on with gun control, certainly I think it's pretty clear based on the numbers we're seeing that greater gun control is required to stop some of the damage that's been happening in some of these schools. But really passionate sort of speech here by this young lady, and it gives me hope to know that we've got people out there willing to use the bully pulpit. In other words, to use the media in some ways to express their opinion. And for a long time now, my generation included, we've been kind of largely absent, I would say, to criticize my own Generation X. But there's hope seeing Gen Z come out here and do the things they've been doing. So watch that video. And also I would say, even now, looking at some of the people who are in Congress, again, not tipping my hat here, but obviously if you think about it, I tend to swing more Democratic, but I love this woman and her ability to kind of go out and expose some of the things, again, using the media and her bully pulpit. In other words, her time on the floor to expose some of the things that that have been going on in politics forever in the day. This cycle of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and how that the politics of the day are kind of feeding that. So again, regardless of what side you fall onto this, you got to appreciate, at minimum, her ability to go out there and at least expose this, which leads to other things. So enjoy those 2 clips. I would like to just mention, as we close here, to read article, if you have time, read the Power of Talk for week 5. That's our main focus for that week. Of course, that's my information there. If you have any questions, you can text or call me at 262-490-7493, or email me. That's the best way, most likely. Or if you want to come out and meet me face-to-face, 2 to 4:30, Monday, Wednesday, or by appointment, always there for you. All right. Hope you enjoyed this. Good luck with everything this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and then we'll see you in week 5.